So hello students, after a long wait, finally NEET PG is over, and yes, the ENT questions where all of you could answer all of them and you were really happy with the ENT questions. So let us quickly do analysis of the ENT questions this time. So we had a total of 7 questions from ENT, out of which one was from here, from complications of CSOM. We had 2 questions from nose, both favorites of NEET PG always. One is from epistaxis, the other atrophic rhinitis. And from the pharynx, we had from the topic of tonsillectomy, again a favorite of NEET. And from the larynx, we had subglottic stenosis. We had a repeated topic, vocal cord palsy, and we had a somewhat new topic, that is the foreign body. And what is important to see here is that out of the 7 questions, 5 of them were emergency. So except for atrophic rhinitis and the subglottic stenosis, rest all the questions were emergency. So which means that that is what we need to focus on always. Yes. So let us quickly start with the questions. So here we have the first question. A patient is brought to the emergency with the complaints of seizures, altered sensorium and headache. He had been undergoing treatment for chronic ear infection, and immediate CT was done, given below. The most probable diagnosis is. So here we have a patient of chronic otitis media who has landed into some intracranial complication, and with the help of history, the seizures, and the typical finding on CT, the ring enhancing mass which we are seeing in the area of the temporal lobe. Yes, this is the ring sign that you are seeing, which is suggestive of an abscess. Yes, in the temporal lobe. So this tells us that the diagnosis of this patient is temporal lobe abscess. So what are the other things that we need to know here, which have been asked in your exams very commonly? So here, yes, temporal lobe abscess is the most common abscess following CSOM. And if in the question, instead of seizures, what else could have been mentioned for you to know that this is temporal lobe abscess? Yes, they could have mentioned nominal aphasia, or they could have mentioned homonymous supraquadrantonopia. Yes, that is a typical, which is known as a pie in the sky appearance. Now, another thing we need to know here is that usually for ear conditions, we do not get radiological investigations done. For ear conditions, the diagnosis is made by audiometric test. So where in conditions of ear do we like to go for radiological investigations? Yes, this is one of them, complications of otitis media. And the other is petrous temporal bone fractures. And in both these contexts have been asked which is the best investigation. So whenever it is ear, whenever it is temporal bone, the best investigation becomes HRCT. So we want to see the extent. So here we get the radiological investigation done, and of choice is HRCT. But yes, specifically if it is asked that this is the intracranial complication like a temporal lobe abscess or lateral sinus thrombosis or meningitis. So in all those cases, like if the radiological investigation has been asked, then you go for which investigation is better? Yes, the MRI. But definitely if it is going from the ear, an HRCT is always required. And another important thing that is asked from you whenever a question of complication of otitis media is given is usually for squamosal otitis media, which was the unsafe otitis media. We do not go for any medical management. The management is always surgical removal of the cholesteatoma, and that is by modified radical mastectomy, MRM. That is the canal wall down mastectomy. Whereas, where do we go for medical management in cases of squamosal CSOM? Yes, if it is associated with complication, then we have to go for medical management. Medical management with IV antibiotics has to be started immediately, and along with that, we have to go for surgical management. And in the surgical management, yes, again, you will go for MRM, canal wall down mastectomy here. And when this question was exactly ditto, the same question has been asked earlier, and there was not asked what the diagnosis is. The same picture was given and was asked, how will you manage this patient? So it is understood you have made the diagnosis as a temporal lobe abscess, and how will you manage the patient? And in the choices was MRM followed by abscess drainage, and the second choice was abscess drainage followed by MRM. So yes, what is the answer? Yes, so in intracranial complications, always the first choice is to manage the intracranial complication first. So it will be abscess drainage followed by MRM. So abscess drainage followed by followed by MRM. So now let us quickly come to the next question. So here the next question here we have is, a patient presents to the emergency with epistaxis. There was no relief on pinching the nostrils. Nasal packing was done, but patient still continues to bleed. What should be the next step? So here we have a patient of epistaxis where the primary management, the first aid management of pinching the nose, which is known as the Hippocratic method or also the Trotter's method, has been done. And what do you think is the next step after Hippocratic method? Yes, the nasal packing also has been mentioned, but if nasal packing was not there, it was asked that after pinching the nose, what is the next step? So is nasal packing immediate next step after pinching the nose? No, the nasal packing is a little, it causes discomfort to the patient. So it is always better that if you can visualize the vessel which is bleeding. We know that the most common site of bleeding is anterior, and that is the Little's area. So why not try to visualize that area and cauterize? That will save the patient of all the discomfort of the packing. So yes, the next step is, the first is pinching the nose, that is the Hippocratic method. The next is the cautery. Cautery can be in the OPD with the help of silver nitrate sticks, or it can be done with the help of the electrical cautery. And there it is very, very important to remember, please note this and remember this, that in the nose we never use unipolar. If you use unipolar in the nose, be it for any surgery that you're doing, septoplasty, FES, or for epistaxis, there are chances of blindness. So that is why we always go for bipolar cautery. Yes, and if still bleeding, then we go for nasal packing. And this nasal packing can be with the help of gauze. That is causes a little more discomfort. That is impregnated with some antibiotic ointment for lubrication, as well as for providing antibiotic to the patient. So here we have nowadays what we use is something like this tampon. When we put it inside the nose, it is like this. It is a thin tampon, and when it gets soaked with blood, it swells up like this, and it applies pressure on the nostril also. And this is much better and much comfortable. Otherwise, we also have nowadays balloons, and these balloons can be anterior as well as posterior. As you can see that when inflated, it will block anterior as well as the posterior nostril. So if on anterior nasal packing it is not relieved, then you go for posterior nasal packing. And posterior nasal packing earlier used to be with the help of gauze, which is nowadays totally become obsolete. Now, if you want to do posterior nasal pack, you usually go for either balloons like this, or what you go for is for a Foley's. As you can see here, you go for Foley's catheter. So, which means that another important thing to remember here is, because nowadays the epistaxis is being focused on, so you should know every little bit about what is important. When you're doing antenasal packing, it is important that you will have to admit the patient. You are packing both the nostrils. Remember, both the nostrils. When you're packing, you will have to admit the patient, and at the same time you will have to give the patient antibiotic cover. And now once you have packed the patient, should you remove the pack after 2 hours, after 4 hours? No, you have to let the pack be there at least for 24 hours, and you can leave it maximum up till 72 hours, after which you remove and see. And if there is no bleeding, good. If it is bleeding, then you can pack again, but you will not leave the pack there for more than 72 hours. And if it still continues to bleed, then posterior nasal pack. And after this, the next is ligation. So what is the hierarchy of ligation that we follow? To remember that, what is remembered and why do we follow that? Yes, again can be asked. So it is seen that the closer the artery that we ligate is to the site of leak, the better the result is, which means that the site of leak is in the nose. So what is the closest? The closest is the sphenopalatine artery. Next is the maxillary. Next is the external carotid. So the closer the site of the leak to the artery, the better is the response. So yes, the 100% response is nowadays achieved by just ligating the sphenopalatine artery, and that is done endoscopically. That is what is known as transendoscopic sphenopalatine artery ligation. Yes, so site is again important. What is the site? Yes, that is at the sphenopalatine foramen, and you know where the sphenopalatine foramen is, 1 centimeter behind the posterior end of middle turbinate. Yes, nowadays internal maxillary artery and external carotid artery ligation have almost become obsolete. Previously they used to be done, but after the advent of endoscope, nowadays mostly 100% result is available just by test pal. And but still, if you want to go for the order and that is what is asked, then this is the order. After sphenopalatine, next in order comes the internal maxillary and next comes the external carotid. So where does the NT8 model fit in? Yes, so NT8 model, according to Scott Brown, this is used as an adjuvant to any of these, which means that nowadays if 100% result is by test pal and if it is not controlled, so as an adjuvant we will go for anterior ethmoidal artery ligation. And where is the internal maxillary ligated? Yes, that is behind the maxillary antrum. So how will you ligate there? How will you give the incision there? How will you reach there? Yes, that is by this incision. What is this incision? This is the Cadwell-Luck approach. Yes. Now, if you want to ligate the anterior ethmoidal, where do you ligate the anterior ethmoidal? Yes, by this incision, and this is known as the medial canthal incision, or this is known as the Lynch-Haworth, or just the Lynch incision, Lynch-Haworth. And once you have given the incision, you raise the skin from over the medial wall of the orbit. And where do you find the NT8 model foramen? So this here is the NT8 model foramen. It is around, yes, this is another important thing to remember. It is around 24 millimeters from the anterior lacrimal crest, And behind that, this foramen that we are seeing is the posterior ethmoidal foramen. That is 12 millimeters from the NT8 model foramen, and behind that, this posterior model foramen is very, very close to the optic canal, and the optic canal, the distance between the posterior model foramen and optic canal is just 6 millimeters. So it is just half, 24, then 12, and then 6. So that is any of these questions are the ones that can be asked. This incision can be shown, and it can be asked that patient of epistaxis was bleeding. This incision was given, which artery is ligated? Yes, so which artery is being ligated here? The NT8 model. If we want to ligate the external carotid, where do we ligate the external carotid? Yes, this is ligated in the neck. This is ligated in the neck. And if I ask you that in the neck, how do you differentiate whether it is external or internal carotid? Both are lying here. Yes? Yes, very good. In the neck, internal carotid does not have any branch. So if you're seeing the branches coming out, it means that is the external carotid. So where do you ligate the external carotid? Usually it is ligated above the first lateral branch. What is the first lateral branch? Above the superior thyroid. So this is what you need to know about the ligation of the vessels in epistaxis. Yes, so here we can see here the ophthalmic coming out through the optic canal, and it gives the branches of the posterior ethmoidal and anterior ethmoidal, and this is how we approach it. Now, if let us quickly see what are the other important things that we need to know in epistaxis, so which have been repeatedly asked. Yes, what is the artery of epistaxis? Yes, it is sphenopalatine artery. How we ligate it? We know it is endoscopically through the nose, that is test pal. The most common cause of anterior as well as posterior epistaxis is again sphenopalatine artery. So what is the artery injured during FES which results in orbital hematoma? So which one is the one which comes through the eye? Yes, that is the NT8 model. NT8 model, and orbital hematoma is an emergency, and to ligate it, you know what the incision is. And the external incision, that is known as the Lynch-Haworth incision. What is the most common site in children and young? Yes, it is the Little's area, the Kisselbach's plexus, The most common cause of epistaxis in children is digital trauma, that is nose picking. And in adults, the most common cause of epistaxis is idiopathic. It is idiopathic, yes. So please remember, the most common cause of epistaxis, be it adult, be it elderly, is idiopathic. Hypertension is no more considered as the most common cause of epistaxis. And if it's a young male who is recurrent epistaxis, then we have to think of angiofibroma. So these are all the questions that have been asked in epistaxis very, very commonly from you. So coming to the next question. A patient presents to the ENT OPD with a complaint of nasal obstruction, nasal discharge, and loss of smell. On examination, nose is filled with yellow-green crust and there is foul-smelling discharge. She is found to have merciful anosmia. Which of the following would will be the most likely finding on examination of the nose? So here the question tells us that this is a patient who is having anosmia. And what is that anosmia? Merciful anosmia typically means that the patient is not aware of this foul smell. There is very foul smelling discharge with yellow green crust. So all these typically tell us that this is a patient of, yes, atrophic rhinitis. So what is asked is, what is the on examination? On examination, what will you find? Yes, what we will find is roomy nasal cavities. We do not find any polyps or foreign body or any hypertrophy. We know that this is the atrophic rhinitis. Everything in the nose atrophies, not hypertrophy. And because of that, the nasal cavities become very roomy. So here, what are the other things that we need to know in atrophic rhinitis, which have been questions? So yes, has been asked that in a patient of atrophic rhinitis, in spite of wide roomy cavities, why is there nasal obstruction? Yes, so why nasal obstruction? Because of excessive crusting. And when there is very foul smelling nasal discharge, then why does the patient have why is the patient not able to sense it? Why is the patient having merciful anosmia? Yes, because there is atrophy of the nerves also. The patient is not able to sense, and also whatever mucosa is present normally also is covered with crust. So the air is not going to is not able to reach till there. So that is why the patient has merciful anosmia. And yes, has been asked the cause. 2 years back was asked what was the cause, and the choices was what is the organism? Yes, it is Klebsiella ozene. And again has been asked last year, atrophic rhinitis. So this is somehow a very favorite question of your exams. And there was asked that there is a patient where a lot of resection of the inferior turbinate has been done, resulting in empty nose syndrome. So this patient can result in which of the following, and one of the choices was atrophic rhinitis. So yes, it is usually primary. The cause is Klebsiella ozene. It is Klebsiella ozene. And if it is secondary, then in secondary, you have to always rule out granulomatous conditions or is surgery. In surgery, it is excessive resection of the turbinates, which is the empty nose syndrome. And these characteristics, any of these if given in the question, they suggest that this is atrophic rhinitis, roomy cavities, foul smelling discharge, merciful anosmia, all of which were present in this question. And yes, coming to the management, yes, the management of these patients is we first are going to remove this crust, the dirty crust, by nasal douching, the content of which is asked in your exam. It is 2:1:1, the sodium chloride, bicarbonate, and biborate. And along with that, we give the lubricant, the glycerine, along with 25% glucose, which is responsible for gets converted to lactic acid, which is proteolytic, and also the chemistine solution. And last year was the question that nasal cavities are closed in which surgery? So in which surgery are the nasal cavities closed? Yes, the Young's operation, and that is done for which condition? Atrophic rhinitis. So these are the important things that we need to know in this condition. So coming to the next question, here we have a child post-tonsillectomy in the recovery room, starts bleeding from the operative site. On examination, lots of clots are seen in the tonsillar fossa. What should be your immediate management? So here we have a child post-tonsillectomy who is having hemorrhage from the operative site. So what is this hemorrhage known as? Is this primary, reactionary, or secondary? Yes, this is the reactionary hemorrhage. What is the duration of primary? That is during surgery on table. What is reactionary? After surgery to within 24 hours. And what is secondary hemorrhage? Secondary hemorrhage is from 24 hours to 10 days. Most commonly, it occurs at 5 to 6 days. And the cause here is infection. So here in this patient, when the patient is now bleeding, what will you do? Yes, you will take the patient again back to the OT. Yes, and then you will inspect the area very carefully. The first step is to remove the clots. Always the clots have to be removed first. Why has reactionary hemorrhage occurred? Why does it occur? Yes, so this surgery of tonsillectomy causes a lot of bleeding. So that is why this is done in hypotensive anesthesia to decrease the blood loss. So when after anesthesia effect is is over, when the blood pressure comes back to normal, there can be dislodgement of clot or there can be slippage of ligature. So now what we are doing here is we are taking the patient back and we are inspecting the area. The first step is to remove the clots. Otherwise, usually we read that whenever there is any clot, leave it. Clot means hemostasis has occurred. But this and another place is uterus, where we remove the clots. Why? For the retraction to occur, for the contraction of the muscles to occur, for the clipping action of the muscle. Which muscle here? We are talking about the superior constrictor to occur, so that it can stop the bleeding. It can contract the blood vessel and stop the bleeding. So that is the first step. You have removed the clots, and if it is still bleeding, then you put pressure with the help of a vasoconstrictor gauze or vasoconstrictor cotton. You put pressure over the area that is bleeding, and if it is still continuing to bleed, then you go for cauterization or for ligation of the bleeding vessel. So last year was a question, in fact this year was a question in INI CET, that what is the most common cause of this hemorrhage. Again, it was a reactionary hemorrhage presentation. What is the cause? Is it arterial or is it venous? Yes, it is venous. Which vein? Yes, it is the paratonsillar vein. That is the paratonsillar vein. Paratonsillar vein is the most common cause of hemorrhage. So that is what protocol you will follow for management. So here, what is the answer? Yes, give anticoagulants and repeated gargling and wait for 24 hours. No. Shift to OT and remove clots and cauterize, ligate the vessel. Yes, so this is true. Let us see the next choice also. Shift to the OT, start IV antibiotics and pack the tonsillar fossa. No. IV antibiotics, if I ask you, will be started in which hemorrhage? Yes, in the secondary hemorrhage, which is because of infection, but not in reactionary. This is reactionary hemorrhage. And do blood transfusion and wait and watch. You do you keep things ready for blood transfusion, but no, you will not just do blood transfusion and wait and watch. So the answer here is B. Answer is B. So yes, this has been a picture that has been shown in your exam and has been asked. Again, the presentation of tonsil was given. Tonsillectomy was given. So what is this instrument? Yes, so this is the coblator wand. And yes, again, it is asked that is this coblation a hot or a cold method? And this is one place that you always get confused and you ask me whether it is hot or cold. What do you think, it is hot or cold? Yes, a cold is everything that does not produce any heat, like you're cutting with a knife or micro debrider or with a scalpel, harmonic scalpel. All that is the cold method, whereas hot method produces heat, like cautery or like laser. The coblation is also hot method, but the heat that it produces is much less than that is produced by laser or by cautery, but still it is a hot method. Coblation is, yes, you are doing coagulation as well as ablation at the same time. So this procedure that is being done, you can see that coagulation is also done at the same time. So the chances of bleeding is much less following coblation. Yes, so now coming to the next question here. Below is given the image of a drug. It is used in which of the following conditions? So what is this drug that is given here? Yes, this is mitomycin C. So let us see the choices. Mucormycosis, no. Subglottic stenosis. Now mitomycin C is actually anti-neoplastic agent. Yes, so it was used in bladder cancer initially. And why are we using it in ENT, and where are the places that we are using it, and why at all are we using it? Now the mitomycin C has also the activity of inhibiting the proliferation of fibroblasts, which means that it reduces the post-operative scarring. So wherever following surgery, we do not want excessive scarring to occur. If excessive scarring occurs, that will make the surgery totally useless. That is where we are using mitomycin C in ENT. So if we talk about ENT, where are the places that we are using it? Yes, the earliest use was in laryngotracheal stenosis and subglottic stenosis. So in subglottic stenosis, yes, first let us see what the answer is. So do we have? Yes, we have subglottic stenosis here. That is the answer. Adenoidectomy, no, we do not use it in following adenoidectomy. Do we not want any scarring to occur in that area? Everywhere if fibrosis occurs following surgery, it is good. But here in some places in subglottic stenosis, what is the most common site of stenosis? It is cricoid, and cricoid is a complete ring all around. Cartilaginous ring all around. It is cartilaginous all around, which means that there is no space for expansion. If we give an incision anywhere on the cartilage, and if scarring occurs, that is going to further narrow the area. And in subglottic stenosis, when we are going to operate, we have to operate on that area of the stenotic segment, which means we again have to operate on the cricoid. So chances of fibrosis will definitely be there following any surgery, but here if fibrosis occurs, it will make the surgery totally useless. So that is why we are using it here following subglottic stenosis. Usually, what are the grades of stenosis? Yes, the Mayer Cotton classification has been asked from you. This classifies the subglottic stenosis into 4 grades, and the grade 1 is up till 50% obstruction, and grade 2 is from 51 to 70%. Grade 3 is 99%, and grade 4 is total obstruction, as we can see here. Usually in grade 1 and early grade 2, no management is required. Patient is not breathless and patient does not have stridor. In late stage 2, what we do is that this cricoid ring, which is narrow, which is stenosed, what we do is we give a split anteriorly and we put a cartilage graft. And the most common graft that we use here is a costal cartilage graft. And in severe stage 3, what we can go for? We can go for a split anteriorly as well as posteriorly, and we can put anterior graft as well as posterior graft. Anterior graft as well as posterior graft. And in stage 4, usually we can go for either the same anterior and posterior split, or we can go for a total resection of the stenotic segment and end-to-end anastomosis. So whatever we are doing, whether we are doing splitting and putting a cartilage, we are operating on the cricoid, which is the complete cartilaginous ring. So it is always advisable to use mitomycin C during surgery, following surgery. And how is it used? It is used topically. It is used topically. There it is applied there for some time, and that serves the purpose of reducing post-operative scarring and reducing restenosis. So what are the other places in ENT that we are using this? Yes, so another place that in ENT is the nose, which is already very narrow area, which is already a very narrow area, and following FES, when we do endoscopic sinus surgery or following septoplasties, what happens is that there are chances of addition because raw areas are created on the both the surfaces, on the lateral wall as well as on the septum, or on the lateral wall as well as the middle turbinate in the middle meatal area. So we need to put a pack there, and when we put a pack there, it is impregnated with mitomycin C to reduce post-operative scarring and adhesion formation. If adhesion forms, then it will make the use of FES totally useless. Now, another place where we use is guanal atresia repair. Again, that we are doing in infants where the nasopharynx is very, very narrow. We do not want any scarring in that area following surgery. So these are the 3 places in ENT where we are using it, the mitomycin C. So now coming to the next question, following total thyroidectomy, a patient started having difficulty in breathing and repeated attempts to extubate were unsuccessful. What can be the cause of this? So again, this has been a different presentation of the same question that has been asked again and again. So here, following thyroidectomy, the patient is having difficulty in breathing, patient is having stridor, and so much so that we are not able to extubate the patient. Patient goes into stridor and dyspnea and breathlessness the moment you remove the endotracheal tube. So what has happened? Yes, palsy has happened. The vocal cord palsy is a very common complication of total thyroidectomy. So which palsy can lead to stridor? Yes, we know it is bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy that will lead to both the vocal cords in the median position. So there will be no space to breathe. Unilateral recurrent laryngeal palsy, how does that present? Unilateral recurrent laryngeal palsy, only one vocal cord is in median position or in paramedian position. The other one is free to move. The other one is freely mobile. So here the patient is usually asymptomatic, or the patient might present with mild hoarseness. So superior laryngeal nerve is the internal laryngeal nerve as well as the external laryngeal nerve. So in palsy of superior laryngeal nerve, because of internal laryngeal going, there will be aspiration. And if external laryngeal goes, then this is responsible for tension, raising the pitch of voice. So that will not be possible. So both these will be the presentation if there's superior laryngeal palsy. And if this difficulty in breathing was because of hematoma, this wouldn't have occurred so quickly, immediately, that when the extubation is occurring, even at that time the hematoma is compressed, and for the hematoma to be able to compress the airway so much so that we are not able to extubate, the patient is having breathlessness and stridor, you will definitely see a big hematoma there. It cannot be that nothing is mentioned here, so it has to be vocal cord palsy. So what are the other things that we need to know in vocal cord palsy? Always in your exam nowadays, what is done is that some surgery is given, base of skull surgery or carotid triangle surgery or thyroid surgery or mediastinal heart surgery, and the presentation is giving patient presents with aspiration, or patient presents with inability to raise the voice, or with mild hoarseness, or as it is given here, stridor. So yes, what we need to know in vocal cord palsy is first that where all can be the injury and what all can be the nerves that can be injured. So if we are talking about the base of skull, at the level of the base of skull, if any presentation is given lateral skull base surgery, what are the nerves that we are going to think of? If you narrow down your options to the nerves, then to only 2 nerves, you do not have to think about so many things. You know that it can be either this or this. So if it is base of skull surgery that has been given in the question, so what are the nerves that you will think about? In the base of skull, what are the parts of the vagus that can be injured? Yes, at the level of base of skull, either there can be complete palsy, or also at the level of the base of skull, just from the inferior ganglion, from the jugular foramen itself, is given off the superior laryngeal nerve, which means that if there is any injury of the base of skull, so base of skull can lead to injury to either the complete vagus, that is complete palsy, or there can be either just a superior laryngeal nerve palsy. Now, if there is some carotid triangle surgery being mentioned, so there, what can be the nerves that you will think about? So when this, where is the carotid triangle? Yes, this area is the carotid triangle, and in the carotid triangle, the superior laryngeal nerve, as it comes down here at the level of the hyoid, it divides into the internal laryngeal, and the external laryngeal goes down to supply the cricothyroid, the only muscle supplied by, which is not supplied by recurrent laryngeal, and the internal laryngeal pierces the thyrohyoid membrane. So which means that at the level of the carotid triangle in the neck, if there is any injury, there can be injury either to the superior laryngeal nerve, or there can be injury to internal laryngeal nerve, or there can be injury to external laryngeal nerve, right? So if there is carotid triangle, we are not going to think about complete palsy. We are not going to think about recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy. In thyroid surgery, what can be the nerves that can be injured? So yes, in thyroid surgery, there can be injury to the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which comes here from the tracheoesophageal groove, and it ascends up and then enters the larynx, and here we have the external laryngeal nerve. Yes, external laryngeal nerve. So which means that at the level of the thyroid, if there is any injury, thyroid surgery is mentioned, what are the nerves that we are going to think about? We are going to think about unilateral rectal laryngeal, we are going to think about bilateral rectal laryngeal, and we are going to think about the external laryngeal nerve. Yes, so these are the nerves that we will think about. And in mediastinal, if any mediastinal surgery is mentioned, then we have to think about only one nerve. And what is that nerve? Yes, that is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Yes, so in a mediastinal, only the left recurrent laryngeal nerve is what we are going to think about. What will be the presentation which will make us think about which nerve? If aspiration is mentioned, we are going to think about internal laryngeal nerve. If what is mentioned is weak voice or inability to raise the pitch, then external laryngeal nerve. And if both are mentioned, then it is superior laryngeal nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve, if it is unilateral palsy, then the patient will have just mild hoarseness, or maybe the patient is asymptomatic. There maybe something else will be asked, yes. And if it is stridor, then it is bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve. And if it is complete palsy, then patient will have voice change, patient will have aphonia along with aspiration. So these permutation and combination of the site of injury, the surgery, as well as the presentation is being given. This is a repeated question from the last few years, and this is very simple. If you just know this much, you will be able to answer any question, and the management will be accordingly. If it is bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy, as this was in this patient of thyroidectomy, then what you're going to do, patient is in stridor, so you immediately have to relieve the stridor. You have to go for immediately a tracheostomy. Stridor means no space in between the vocal cords. So what are you going to do? Later on, you will lateralize one vocal cord. So that is what you need to know. Again, what is asked here is that which is more commonly injured, the left or the right recurrent laryngeal? Yes, the longer courses goes into the mediastinum is which one? Left. So more commonly injured is left. Whereas if you're talking about neck surgeries, if we're talking about thyroidectomy, if we're talking about some surgery of the larynx or esophagus, then in neck surgeries, which is more prone to injury, the right or the left recurrent laryngeal, then the answer becomes right recurrent laryngeal, because that is intermingled with the branches of inferior thyroid artery. So it is more difficult to separate it, and while we are ligating the inferior thyroid artery, there can be injury very commonly to the right recurrent laryngeal. So that was what we needed to know there. So coming to the next question, a mother gets her child to the doctor with a complaint that the child is not able to swallow anything since the past few hours. She is not sure but says that the child was playing with a coin. On examination, vitals were stable and there was no dyspnea. What is the diagnosis? So here the child has ingested something. It is clearly given that the child was playing with something, and now the child is not able to swallow, which means that the passage for swallowing is blocked. So it is, the history also tells you that this is of the esophagus. But anyway, let us see what the X-ray is showing us. Yes, so usually you will do this in the foreign bodies of the esophagus in surgery, but I have taken up this question. Why? Because this is one foreign body that maybe you will have to differentiate from a larynx foreign body, and when will the answer of this become a larynx, and how by the X-ray we come to know whether this is a laryngeal or a tracheal foreign body, or this is an esophageal foreign body. So let us see. Yes, so in the esophagus, when the foreign body goes, the esophagus is here. Yes, this is the esophagus. Now the esophagus, the maximum diameter is the horizontal diameter. So when the coin goes, it gets stuck with the maximum diameter horizontally. The maximum diameter will be horizontally, which means that when you see this patient in the AP view, it appears end face like this. Whereas if this patient you are going to see from one side, how is it going to appear? Yes, it is going to appear sagittal like this. So what will happen in larynx? Yes, in larynx, the maximum diameter is the AP diameter. So if on AP view, what you are seeing is, on AP view, if you are seeing the end face, then this is esophagus. If you are seeing like this, only on one curve, one end, then that is the larynx. And on lateral view, again, see something, notice something on the lateral view. Here, see the lateral view, see the airway. Can you see the airway? Can you see the airway here? Yes, can you see that this foreign body is behind the airway? This foreign body that you're seeing, this foreign body is behind this airway that you're seeing. Yes, so definitely this one is not in the airway, this is behind the airway, which means this is in the esophagus. Whereas here we can see the foreign body is in the airway itself. So this is what we need to remember. In AP view, end face is esophagus, and in AP view, if it is sagittal, then it is trachea or the larynx. And then that is when we get the lateral view done, you see the airway very clearly. So that is the esophagus. Okay, now another question that is asked from you here is that what is the most common site of lodgement of the foreign body of the esophagus? Is it at or just above the cricopharyngeal sphincter, or is it at or just below the cricopharyngeal sphincter? What do you think? No, it is not above the cricopharyngeal sphincter. It is below, just below, at or just below the cricopharyngeal sphincter. Why? Yes, because the tone of the muscles above the cricopharyngeal sphincter is very high, because their function is to push the foot down when the cricopharyngeal sphincter opens. So they usually push the coin down. So just below the cricopharyngeal sphincter, the tone of the muscles of the esophagus is a more relaxed tone. It is less. Why? Because it has to dilate as the foot comes down. So the most common site of lodgement is at or just below the cricopharyngeal sphincter. So what is the answer here? Yes. So here the diagnosis is, we can see here, this is a foreign body of the esophagus. Now the foreign body, soft tissue, neck and foreign body prevertebral space, you can remove. No need to think about that also. Why? Because this is a coin. How can the coin, when the patient is swallowing, it can either go into the respiratory passage, maybe the patient inhales it, or maybe the patient swallows it into the esophagus. It will never, how can it penetrate and go into the soft tissue of the neck anteriorly or prevertebral space posteriorly, unless and until it is a sharp foreign body. Yes, this is a coin that we are seeing very clearly. So that brings us to the end of the questions of ENT. And yes, I know you already knew all that, and that was just a very quick revision for you. So INI CET is done and dusted. And again, another is approaching. So let us quickly do the recall of the last session, so that yes, definitely there are the important topics, and these important topics are very, very commonly repeated. So let us do a quick analysis of the questions of ENT first. So there were a total of 6 questions in the last Central Institute exam, out of which 1 was from the ear, 3 were from the nose, and in the nose there were repeated topics of the arterial supply, and here it was a CT. The radiological investigations have been asked repeatedly. Almost 1 question is there always from the radiological investigation, be it X-ray or be it CT. The nerve supply is again a repeated question, and allergic fungal sinusitis has been asked repeatedly now for how many years? Again, can be repeated. So in the pharynx, we had the question from tonsillectomy, which was also there in NEET PG also. And yes, the arterial supply also was there in NEET PG, and we had a question from adenoid. So let us quickly start with the questions. So here we have the first question: identify the mark structure. And even if just by a look at the CT, you feel that no, I do not know what this is. Let us see the choices. Yes, so this is anterior ethmoidal canal, posterior ethmoidal canal, cribriform plate, and bulla ethmoidalis. So at least let us rule out. We can see the arrow here. This definitely is not cribriform plate. Where is cribriform plate? This here is the crista galli. This is the medial lamella. Yes, and we have the lateral lamella. Yes, so we have the medial lamella and we have the lateral lamella. This is the cribriform plate, and here the cribriform plate is meeting with the orbital plate of the frontal bone. This is the fovea ethmoidalis. So this bone is the fovea ethmoidalis. This is the cribriform plate. So definitely this arrow we can see is not at the cribriform plate. So this gets ruled out. So this is ruled out. Yes. Another choice we have here is bulla ethmoidalis. Bulla ethmoidalis is the largest anterior ethmoidal air cell, and we can see that this is definitely not pointing at one of the air cell. So this is also not bulla ethmoidalis. So we are left with 2 choices: anterior ethmoidal canal and posterior ethmoidal canal. So what are these anterior and posterior ethmoidal canal? Yes, we know that from the orbit, the anterior ethmoidal artery and the nerve, same posterior ethmoidal artery and the nerve, has to come from the orbit into the nose. So they pierce the lamina papyracea to come into the nose to the respective canals, anterior ethmoidal artery and nerve to the anterior ethmoidal canal, and the posterior ethmoidal artery and nerve to the posterior ethmoidal canal. Now so it has to be one of these. Now can you make out that this is an anterior view or a quite posterior? Yes, the posterior ethmoidal canal is quite posteriorly, which means that it will be very posteriorly. It is very near to the apex of the orbit, which means that we will not be able to see such big round orbits at the level of the posterior ethmoidal canal. Yes, so even if you try to think it a little logically, you will come to the answer, and that is anterior ethmoidal canal. So yes, the answer here is anterior ethmoidal canal. So what exactly is anterior ethmoidal canal? I just told you. Now let us see little more about the anterior ethmoidal canal. So yes, we have the this what we are seeing here is the optic canal, the optic foramen, and this here is the superior orbital fissure, right? So here we have the optic foramen, optic canal, through which enters the ophthalmic artery. Yes, ophthalmic artery along with the optic nerve. So we have the ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery comes into the eye and it gives certain branches to the eye, and along with that it gives two important branches to the nose. One is the anterior modal artery and the other is the posterior modal. So from here it enters and it gives branch to the anterior modal canal, that is anterior modal artery, and here is the posterior modal artery. Now both these arteries, they will pierce this medial wall of the orbit, the lamina papyracea, and they will enter into the nose, right? Now in the nose, they will supply not only the lateral wall of the nose, but yes, we know that the anterior and posterior modal artery also supply the septum, yes or no? We know there are parts of the septum where the anterior modal artery, yes, we can see here the anterior modal and the posterior modal piercing the lamina papyracea. So they are also, the anterior modal artery is also part of the Kieselberg's plexus. We know that, yes, which means that from the orbit, it has to come till the septum, right? So let us see how it does it. So from the orbit, it pierces the lamina papyracea, and where exactly does it pierce? Yes, please note this this prominence that you are seeing here. This is what is known as the anterior modal notch, and this is where are you going to find it? Try to look for it. Yes, that is in between the two muscles. Here is the medial rectus and superiorly the superior oblique. So in between these two, you will find the prominence. That is what is known as the anterior modal notch, and from here it directly goes to the cribriform plate. Yes, and from the cribriform plate, now it again enters the septum, and it supplies the septum. Okay, now what is the significance of this notch? This notch is also known as nipple sign on the CT. Now, what is the significance of this notch is, just see here. If sometimes what happens is that the anterior ethmoids are very much pneumatized, as you can see here in this CT, you can see that the pneumatization is extending above the orbit also. So in this case, what happens is that this anterior ethmoidal artery passes through the ethmoidal air cells to reach the cribriform plate, which means that in this patient, where we are going to operate to remove disease from the anterior ethmoids, the anterior ethmoids are filled with disease. And if we are not careful and we do not know that we will have to look for the artery there, what will happen is we might, along with the disease, pull this mesentery in which this artery is passing, and this will lead to injury to the artery, and that will lead to bleeding following pes. And if it is just a bleeding which can be stopped by packing, that is fine. But if this artery retracts into the orbit back, what will happen? It will result in orbital hematoma. Yes, just see here, falling fez. If the patient presents with this, yes, you can be asked that what has occurred, what has been injured. Yes, so what has occurred here is that there has been injury to the anterior ethmoidal artery. That is why before FES it is mandatory that we get the CT done and we look for this particular structure, the anterior ethmoidal artery. And this notch is what is known as the nipple sign. This is where you are going to find the prominence in between these two muscles, and you are going to exactly see it like this. So that is what is being pointed here. So along with the artery also passes the nerve. So maybe instead of canal, next time is asked anterior ethmoidal artery, posterior ethmoidal artery, or anterior ethmoidal nerve instead of anterior ethmoidal canal. So all these are the same things. Through the anterior ethmoidal canal, enter the anterior ethmoidal artery and the nerve. So if injured, what will happen? There will be orbital hematoma, which is the emergency condition because that will lead to compression of the optic nerve that can lead to permanent blindness. Orbital hematoma has to be drained immediately, which means that also this artery has to be ligated immediately. So if you have to ligate this artery following FES, if the patient presents like this, what should be your management? So how can you ligate this artery? Yes, so you can ligate this artery either endoscopically or you can give external incision here. This is what is known as the medial canthal incision, also known as the Lynch-Haworth incision or the Lynch incision. and you are going to raise the skin, and you have to reach up till the anterior ethmoidal canal. And how far is the anterior ethmoidal canal from the anterior lacrimal crest? So from the anterior lacrimal crest, it is, yes, 24, approximately 24 millimeters. You will have to raise the skin. So there you will find the anterior ethmoidal artery where you're going to ligate it, and a little more posteriorly, that is around 12 millimeters posterior to the anterior ethmoidal canal, you will find the posterior ethmoidal artery. That is where it is ligated, and you can see that it is very close to the optic foramen. So that is optic canal, that is just 6 millimeters. So it is just half, 24, 12 and 6. So this posterior ethmoidal canal is very clear to the optic foramen, that is very clear to the orbital apex. So this picture that we saw has to be anterior ethmoidal canal. So let us see some important structures on the CT which can be your questions. And yes, this structure, quickly you are going to tell me what is this that you are seeing here. Yes, this marked structure. Yes, this is, yes, very good. This is bulla ethmoidalis. Very good. This was again a question of your INI CET, was marked this and was asked what this is. Yes, so this is, yes, this is the anterior ethmoidal cell, and this is the agar nasi. And this agar nasi can also be given to you on the CT. And how does this appear on the CT? So this air cell that you are seeing is, what is the agar nasi? So how do you know that this air cell is not bulla ethmoidalis? Yes, and can you tell me what this is? This sinus is this the frontal sinus that you're seeing, or is this the extension of the anterior ethmoids above the eye? Supraorbital extension of the anterior ethmoids. Yes, so please note, how are you going to find this out? Is the frontal sinuses are the anteriormost sinuses, so they will be present only in the anterior cuts. And by the time the maxillary sinus start appearing in the cuts, till that time the frontal sinus would have disappeared. So which means that what we have to look for is the maxillary sinus. Can you see the maxillary sinuses here are so small, they are just appearing, which means that this is the anteriormost cut, and this sinus that you are seeing here, this is the frontal sinus, and the agar nasi is the anteriormost anterior ethmoidal cell. So it is seen at the level of the frontal sinus, you will be able to see. So this is the agar nasi. Now just say here, now can you tell me this that you're seeing, this is the frontal sinus or this is the anterior ethmoid? Yes, so see the maxillary sinuses, they are so well developed here, which means this is the posterior cut. So in the posterior cut, when we see the maxillary sinuses very nicely, at that level, the frontal sinuses would have been disappeared till that time, till that area, till that level. So here what we are seeing here, this is not the frontal sinus, this is the anterior ethmoid. The anterior ethmoids, and at the level of the posterior ethmoids, the orbit would start tapering down. We will not see such big orbits, round orbits at the level of the posterior ethmoid. So can you tell me what is this structure that has been marked here? What is this? Yes, this is the intraorbital. What is this known as? The Haller cell. Very good. This is the Haller cell. And yes, can you tell me what is this? What I have marked as 1. What is this? Yes, this is the sphenoid sinuses. And what is this 2? Yes, this 2 is what is the posterior ethmoidal cell, which is in relation to the sphenoid sinus. Can you name that? Yes, that is the Onodi cell. Now, why is this not another part of the sphenoid sinus? Which means that sphenoid sinus, like frontal sinus, can also have septations. So is it a septa that we are seeing, and we are seeing another part of the sphenoid sinus which has been separated from the sphenoid sinus to the septa? No. How do we decide that this is a septa or this is a Onodi cell? Yes, the septations always are like this. Yes, they are vertical or they are oblique. Yes, they are never horizontal. If you are seeing a horizontal septation, then this is the Onodi cell. And Onodi cell is in relation to which structures? So here, this structure, what is this? This is the optic nerve. And here laterally, we have the internal carotid artery. Yes, can you make out this? What is this? Yes, this is the middle turbinate, and we can see that this middle turbinate is pneumatized. This middle turbinate is pneumatized. What is that known as? Yes, that is concha bullosa. Yes, and what is this here? This is the cribriform plate, right? This is the cribriform plate. This is the medial lamella. This is the lateral lamella. So we can see a very thin bone here. This is the lateral lamella, and this thick bone that we are seeing, this is the orbital plate of the frontal bone forming the roof of the ethmoid. This is what is known as fovea ethmoidalis. Fovea ethmoidalis. So this junction of the fovea ethmoidalis with the lateral lamella of the cribriform plate, we can see lateral lamella of cribriform plate is a very thin bone. So this is a very area in between these two. The junction is a very weak area which is very prone to fractures following injury, and that is the most common site of CSF leak. So the most common site of CSF rhinorrhea we know is fracture of the cribriform plate. It is not the fovea ethmoidalis, it is the cribriform plate. So coming to the next question, we have here, which procedure is shown in the following figure? And again, this has become a very, very favorite question of your Central Institute exam. Now, let me just quickly give you a recap of 2 years back. 2 years back was the anesthesia of a picture given where the anesthesia of the internal laryngeal nerve at the thyrohyoid membrane, just below the hyoid, was this injection being given, and was asked which nerve. So that is the internal laryngeal nerve. Last year was again, from last 2 years, anesthesia of the nose has been given. So somehow they are liking this very much. So let us quickly see what this is. Is this the intratrochlear block? Is this the nasociliary block? Is this anterior model block, or is it intraorbital block? So we can just rule out one, intraorbital. We know intraorbital foramen is inferior to the orbit, somewhere here, through which comes out the intraorbital nerve, so which means that this cannot be this. We have ruled out here this one. Now, nasociliary block or anterior model or intratrochlear. So let us quickly have a look at the nerve supply of the nose, of the external nose. So this picture we have seen earlier in relation to the arterial supply. Now let us see in relation to the nerve supply. So we have the supraorbital fissure. From the supraorbital fissure comes in the ophthalmic nerve. Does the ophthalmic nerve enter as ophthalmic nerve? No, it branches into three. The lacrimal, that lateral most, lacrimal. Then we have the frontal, goes like this. And then we have the nasociliary. The medial most is the nasociliary. Nasociliary, yes. Now this nasociliary comes medially, and this gives the branches to the anterior and posterior ethmoidal canal. Yes, we have the posterior ethmoidal nerve and we have the anterior ethmoidal nerve going through the same name foramen along with the same name vessels into the nose. Yes, and then this ends as this now also supplies the intratrochlear. The frontal gives the supraorbital and the supratrochlear like this. Yes, so we have the intratrochlear. Now have a look at this picture here. So yes, you can see what I just drew for you there. So we have the nasociliary nerve. This here is the nasociliary, this one, giving the posterior ethmoidal nerve, this one posterior ethmoidal, and the anterior ethmoidal, and then it is going further anteriorly, and it is this here is the intratrochlear nerve. Yes, now the anterior ethmoidal nerve, it pierces the lamina papyracea, as you can see here. So the anterior ethmoidal nerve pierces the lamina papyracea. It supplies the lateral wall of the nose, and then it comes out at the junction of the nasal bone with the upper lateral cartilage. This area, it comes out, and as you can see in this picture, yes, just see here, this one, see, it comes out, and this is what is known as the external nasal. This is known as the external nasal, which means if you're talking about the external nose, what is the nerve supply? So this part, the whole part, this here, yes, till here, all this is by the branches of nasociliary, that is the ophthalmic. We already know that, right? Yes, we know. We know that this is the ophthalmic, the green is the ophthalmic, and that is the first branch of the trigeminal V1. This is the maxillary, and this is the mandibular, right? We know that. So here this part is the intratrochlear, this part is the intratrochlear of the external nose, and this lower part is the external nasal branch of the anterior ethmoidal. So which means that if this picture is given to you and is asked which nerve is being anesthetized, yes, this was exactly the picture that was given last year. So which nerve is this? Yes, this is the external nasal. If in the choice external nasal is not given, then what can be the choice? Yes, anterior ethmoidal nerve. Okay. Now this picture, something like this has been given here. Now here, what will you mark? Is this the intratrochlear, or is this the nasociliary, or is this the NT8 model? So see here, it is at this quite superficial in the nose. So this is the infratrochlear. So where will be the nasociliary or the NT8 model? Yes, just see here. A little more medial. Here was the infratrochlear. Here in this area will be the infratrochlear, and little more medial. When you're going to the medial wall of the orbit, and when you're going posteriorly, you can anesthetize both the NT8 model as well as the nasociliary, right? So the nasociliary and the NT8 model have to be, when they are blocked, the anesthesia, the needle is passed in the same, because we know that the NT8 model, where it is given off, it is the branch of the nasociliary. So if we inject anesthetic there, the nasociliary also will get blocked. So which means that this question that is asked here, so what is the answer here? Yes, so the answer is the intratrochlear block. So the answer is intratrochlear block. No, not nasociliary, not NT8 model. Had it been a little more medial, then it could be, then both wouldn't have been given in the choice. Nasociliary and NT8 model, both would not be given in the choice. Yes, now this, what is the nerve that is being anesthetized here? Yes, so this is the inferior orbital nerve. We know that the infraorbital foramen is the exit of the inferior orbital nerve. And what is the inferior orbital nerve? A branch of, yes, we can see here that the trigeminal second branch, that's the maxillary, it enters through the foramen rotundum. It exits the cranium and enters into the sphenopalatine fossa, that is just behind the maxillary sinus. We know the sphenopalatine fossa very nicely. Here it gives the certain branches, and it continues through the floor of the orbit, through the inferior orbital canal. So it is known as inferior orbital nerve now. And now it exits through the inferior orbital foramen, and it gives the nerve supply to the this part of the cheek, and this part of the ala and the external nose, right? So this here is the intraorbital nerve. This is the intraorbital nerve. So if we want to anesthetize here, we can either pass the needle at the level of the intraorbital foramen, or also what we can do here is just see, the second picture. I'm going to draw in this picture. Or what you can do is, at the level of the second premolar, you can inject the needle. You can inject the needle sublabially, and you will enter here. So you can put a finger here externally, and you can inject the needle internally sublabial. Yes, like this. So sublabial you are giving at the second premolar. You are injecting the anesthetic. You are reaching at this level. So these are the two ways that you can anesthetize the inferior orbital nerve. So if this picture is given, next time you know which nerve is being anesthetized, the inferior orbital nerve. So if this is given, what is, yes, the anesthesia is at the sphenopalatine foramen, that is 1 centimeter behind the middle turbinate. So this is the sphenopalatine nerve, or the sphenopalatine ganglion block. And another way of blocking the sphenopalatine ganglion is, just see here in this picture. Yes, I'm going to draw here. You can reach through the palate. Through the palate, you can also, through the where the greater palatine nerve is entering, you can inject the anesthetic at that level, which means you can do something like this. Yes, so these are two ways of anesthetizing the sphenopalatine nerve, or the sphenopalatine ganglion, either through the nose, transnasally, where you can put the soaked cotton, the cotton soaked with the anesthetic, or you can inject also in this level. At this area, you can inject with the syringe also, or also what you can do is, through the greater palatine foramen, you can inject the anesthetic into the sphenopalatine fossa. So these are the various blocks, yes, which you need to know. So coming to the next question, which is not a major criteria for the diagnosis of allergic fungal sinusitis? Again, a very, very favorite question of the institute exams, allergic fungal sinusitis. So what is being asked, or is the major criteria? Yes, so this is known as the Bent and Kuhn criteria. Bent and Kuhn. Bent and Kuhn criteria, and there, what are these is, we actually already know what these are, but we just have to know that they are the major criteria. Yes. So the allergic fungal sinusitis, let us decipher it from the name. Yes, allergic fungal. Allergic means, yes, this patient has to be atopic. Patient has to be atopic means that, yes, the Ig levels will be raised. It is a type 1 hypersensitivity. Ig levels will be raised. Yes. And it is fungal sinusitis. It is allergy to the fungus. How does the fungus go into the sinus? Yes, it is entrapped fungus through breathing, which has got entrapped into the sinuses. So that is that patient, that person in whose sinus this has gotten trapped, that person is highly allergic to this particular fungus. So it is eliciting a very severe allergic response. So in response, the severe allergic response consists of a lot of secretions which contain a lot of eosinophils. Those eosinophils in the secretions give the secretions a very sticky consistency. That is what is known as the mucinous secretions. Mucinous secretions, and these mucinous secretions contain the fungal element. So if we go for a fungal smear, we are going to see fungal elements in the mucinous secretions. And because of the mucinous secretions, which are very sticky, the meatus gets obstructed, the ostia of the sinuses get obstructed. That leads to chronic sinusitis, and this prolonged obstruction can lead to polyp formation. So in the nose, what you're going to see, polyp. And one particular characteristic of this fungus is that it entraps metals, and this entrapment of the metals on CT will give a heterogeneous appearance, and that is what is known as the double density sign. The double density sign. Yes. So all this we already know, and we have done it in quite detail. Yes. When we did the allergic fungal sinusitis. So now we are seeing that we have these 5 important things, which chronologically one thing is leading to the other. And this is what is the 5 major criteria. All these, if present, is what is the diagnosis of allergic fungal sinusitis. So nasal polyps, yes. Mucinous discharge, yes. Fungal culture, so it is fungal smear, not fungal culture. Characteristic CT findings, yes. So which is not, what is asked is not. So the answer is the fungal culture. That is not a major criteria. So what we can see here, yes, the endoscopic appearance appears like this. Had been a presentation given to you. What was the presentation? This is, yes, another important thing that we need to remember in allergic fungal sinusitis is that this is seen in middle age. This is seen in middle age, and this is usually a unilateral presentation. So was given that a 40-year-old or a 35-year-old female presents with unilateral nasal obstruction, mucinous secretions, nasal polyps. So most probable diagnosis is, or her CT will show what? Yes. So what will the CT show? This is the typical, which is known as a double density sign. Yes, recently this picture, only the CT was given and was asked what is the sign that is being shown here. And the choices were onion peel appearance and ground glass appearance. Yes. So what we are seeing here is the double density sign. There's a double density sign, and yes, in what is seen in the CT when it was asked, the proper clinical presentation was given. So from the clinical presentation, you can make out that that is allergic fungal sinusitis. So yes, these are whenever a presentation like this is given, a middle age with nasal obstruction, nasal discharge, hyposmia, which means that these are features of chronic sinusitis. So this will be a patient of chronic sinusitis, which, how do you know chronic? Yes, for more than 3 months. Yes, now presenting with any of these. Yes, now presenting with nasal obstruction, now presenting with mucinous nasal discharge. On endoscopy, what you're seeing is nasal polyps, and also what you might be seeing, these words might be mentioned: peanut butter appearance, axle grease appearance. All these are suggestive of allergic fungal sinusitis. And double density sign, yes. So another important thing that you need to know here, which has not yet been asked, but yes, it can be asked, is the management of allergic fungal sinusitis. Why you need to know is because it is a little different. The name tells you it is fungal sinusitis, but yes, the management here, we do not give antifungal. We do not give antifungal in the pre-op or in the post-op. The main management is FES. Now, why do you not give antifungal here? if you know what the cause is, you know why you're not doing it. Yes, what is the cause? It is not an inherent systemic condition. What has happened is that during inhalation the fungus has gone and it has gotten trapped. So it is some foreign body, something like a foreign body which has gotten trapped, through which the body is reacting through very severe allergic response. So what you have to do is, once you have removed all of the fungal elements which are causing the allergy, there is no need to do anything more. There's no need to give antifungal. In fact, if you just give antifungal, that won't work also, because this is the allergic reaction to the fungus. So what we have to do is, you have to completely remove all these fungal elements with all the polyps and clear the osteometal complex area, and you have to restore the ventilation and drainage, and that is with the help of FES. So you do FES, and here again, very, very important to remember is that in the post-operative period, you give steroids. You give steroids local as well as nasal spray. Nasal spray, as well as you can give a short course of systemic steroids also. Now, why steroids? This is another thing you asked me, that why steroids? This is a fungal infection. Now, once you have removed all the fungus, now this is a very severe allergic reaction. There is a lot of edema. The allergic edema is very severe. So when we give steroids in the post-operative period, it helps to restore the ventilation and drainage of the sinuses, and it helps to restore the normalcy very, very quickly. So that is why post-operative steroids are given. And only if the patient is not responding well following surgery, only then there is some role of antifungal. Otherwise, usually antifungals are not given here. So this is the Bent and Clune criteria, the major criteria. All the 5 have to be present for the diagnosis of allergic fungal sinusitis. The minor criteria are just supportive. And even if you do not remember the minor criteria, it is okay, as long as you remember all the major criteria. Minor criteria also, if you want to remember, I have put it in this table in this form that you will remember it. It will be easier for you to remember. So nasal polyps always will be unilateral, mostly unilateral, might be rarely bilateral, but yes, usually it is unilateral. Type 1 hypersensitivity, because of that there will be certain other features of type 1 hypersensitivity also, like asthma, like serum eosinophilia, and the eosinophilic eosinophils in the mucin might also contain the breakdown products of the eosinophil, that is the charcot-laden crystals. And the CT will show the heterogeneous appearance, the double density sign, but it might also show bone erosion. Yes. So just remember that bone erosion, if present, if you see in the question bone erosion, don't think that this is only, it has to be a carcinoma. There can be bone erosion also in allergic fungal sinusitis. Why? Is it an invasive fungal sinusitis? Is it mucormycosis that can erode the bone? No. This allergic fungal sinusitis can cause bone erosion. Why? Yes, because the mucin has got a very expansive nature. As just see here. Yes, can you see here? The ethmoid sinuses are appearing to be expanded. Yes, see here. They are appearing to be so much expanded. We can see the heterogeneous appearance, that this lamina papyracea is appearing eroded here. Can you see? There are erosions. So because of the expansive nature of the, just see here again. Yes. So because of the expansive nature of the mucin, the bone can thin and can also lead to erosion. So if there is erosion that is mentioned, don't think that it has to be only carcinoma, or it has to be invasive fungal sinusitis like mucormycosis. And yes, fungal culture, which was given in the choice here, that is a part of the minor criteria, that is not a part of the major criteria. So that is what we need to know here in allergic fungal sinusitis. So let us start with the next question. So we have a given below is the histopathology. So yes, a histopathology slide has been given, and this is of an operated mass. So post-op, 50-year-old male who gave the history of tinnitus and hearing loss in the right ear for the past 7 years. Okay, and recently he started having some loss of balance and persistent headache. His audiometry showed moderate sensorineural hearing loss in the right ear. So this is a post-operative person, and what were his complaints? So he had unilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Yes, progressive over 7 years, only in the right ear. So any elderly with unilateral sensorineural hearing loss,
Yes, later on, after 7 years, maybe some imbalance he is having, persistent headache he is having. So any unilateral sensorineural hearing loss in elderly, if there's sensorineural hearing loss, it has to be bilateral, that is presbycusis. But if it is unilateral, what do we need to rule out? Yes, acoustic neuroma. So yes, this is acoustic neuroma. Even the history it is telling us, and yes, the histopathology. What is the histopathology showing you? Yes, this is the Antony type A, the closely packed, typically closely packed, the Antony type A or the Antony type B appearance. Yes, so the Antony type B is the loosely arranged, vacuolated, which contains lots of cysts. Now, what is the significance of knowing this microscopic appearance and dividing it into Antony type A and Antony type B when it is anyway post-operative? Yes, so if it is Antony type B, yes, loosely arranged. So if it is loosely arranged, if it contains a lot of cyst, so cysts have the propensity of sudden enlargement of the cyst because of hemorrhage within the cyst. So that can lead to sudden growth of the tumor. And since this is a tumor which is present in a very important area, crucial area, CP angle, where we have all around important structures, we have the cranial nerve, 5th, 6th, 9th, and 11th, we have the cerebellum there. So that is why when we know that it is a cystic appearance that you can make out on MRI. So if on MRI you can make out it is a cystic appearance, you know that this will have the Antony type, that will be Antony type B. If it is cystic, then we know that this can enlarge. We do not give the option of wait and watch to this patient, even if the tumor is small. We always operate. So this is a patient of acoustic neuroma. Now, otherwise also, let us see what the other choices are. Meniere's. Can this be Meniere's? Meniere's. What is the first symptom of Meniere's? Do you ever think of Meniere's without vertigo? Yes, so here in Meniere's, always the first symptom is vertigo. It is not that chronically the patient will have unilateral sensorineural hearing loss and later on mild imbalance. So this cannot be Meniere's. Glomus jugulaire will not have sensorineural hearing loss. Here will be conductive hearing loss. Yes, and the tinnitus, whenever a question of glomus jugulaire has been mentioned to you, has been given to you, always has been mentioned pulsatile tinnitus. So no, this is not glomus jugulaire. Cholesteatoma, no, this is not cholesteatoma. Though in cholesteatoma we will have yes, we will have typically the features of conductive hearing loss. So here this is a patient of acoustic neuroma. And what are the other things that you need to know? Yes, so any elderly in acoustic neuroma in elderly, unilateral progressive sensorineural hearing loss. The test will show unilateral sensorineural hearing loss, the audiometry test, and a very, very commonly a sign is the absence of sensation in the posterior part of the external acoustic matrix. Can you tell me what this is known as? Yes, this is known as the Hitzelberger sign. Hitzelberger sign, very commonly asked sign. And what is the site of origin is another important question. Yes, the site of origin is the, out of these, if it is marked, yes, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is 4. So can you now tell me which one? Yes, maybe this, they give you like this. So it arises from where? Yes, most commonly from, we can see this one is the 3 is the cochlear. Yes, so 4 is the inferior vestibular. So most commonly it arises from the inferior vestibular nerve in the internal acoustic meatus. Inferior vestibular nerve, not in the CP angle. Once this question was asked, where 2 choices were given, inferior vestibular nerve in the internal acoustic meatus, the other choice was inferior vestibular nerve in the CP angle. So it is inferior vestibular nerve in the internal acoustic meatus. Earliest ocular sign is, yes, loss of corneal reflex. The corneal reflex, and the corneal reflex goes here because of which nerve? Again, that has been a question. That is because of corneal reflex. The afferent is 5th, efferent is 7th. So here it is because of 5th nerve. Why because of 5th nerve? Why not the 7th nerve? Yes, because the 7th, we know that the 7th nerve, for the corneal reflex to go because of the 7th nerve, the motor part of 7th nerve has to go, and the motor part of 7th nerve is quite resistant to external compression. So when the external compression from the tumor occurs on the 7th nerve, the sensory part gets involved early, and that sensory part involvement leads to what is known as the Hitzelberger sign. The best investigation, if we talk about the best audiometric test, that will be BERA, whereas the best investigation will be MRI. And on BERA, can you tell me what is the finding which is diagnostic of acoustic neuroma? Yes, the latency, you compare the latency of wave 5 of both the ears. So if there's a difference which means interoral latency difference of wave 5 of more than 0.2 milliseconds, that is suggestive of acoustic neuroma. But the best, it is intracranial tumors, the best is MRI. Yes, so rehabilitation in a patient of neurofibromatosis type 2 with bilateral acoustic neuromas operated for the same is by ABI, auditory brainstem implant, which you put in the lateral recess of the fourth ventricle. Lateral recess of fourth ventricle. Yes, so here this is the MRI that is given. Yes, we know that this is the part of the petrous temporal bone, and we can see here mass in the CP angle, and we can also make out that this mass is coming, we can see this coming from the internal acoustic matrix in the CP angle. So this is what is the typical appearance of the acoustic neuroma, and histopathology will show what? Either Antony type A or Antony type B. A 6-year-old child with a history of recurrent attacks of tonsillitis underwent surgery. His post-operative period was uneventful. On the next day, during morning round, he had mild bleeding from the oral cavity. Look at the following picture and comment on the source of bleeding. Yes, so here we have a child who had undergone a tonsillectomy, and following tonsillectomy, the child is now having bleeding. And when is the child having bleeding? Following the next day, which means what is this hemorrhage? Is it a primary or a reactionary or a secondary hemorrhage? Primary is on table, reactionary is after surgery to within 24 hours, and secondary is from 24 hours to 10 days. Most common time of secondary hemorrhage is 5 to 6 days. Why? Because the cause is infection, and infection takes that much time to build up. So secondary hemorrhage, usually it occurs because of infection. So this is a reactionary hemorrhage. So why does reactionary hemorrhage occur? Yes, why does bleeding following surgery occur? So this is a surgery which is done in hypotensive anesthesia to decrease the blood loss during surgery. So now what happens following the effect of anesthesia? Once the effect of anesthesia is gone, now the blood pressure will come back to normal, and that can lead to increase in the blood supply of the vessels, that can lead to dislodgement of the clot, that can lead to slippage of the ligature, and that is the cause usually of reactionary hemorrhage. So what we do not need the picture also in this to make the to find out the answer. What is asked is what is the source of bleeding, most common source of bleeding following tonsillectomy. So what is the source of bleeding? Is it arterial or is it venous? Yes, we know it is not arterial, it is venous. So that makes the answer, this is not facial artery, not this artery, not this artery. What is it? It is the vein. Yes, it is a paratonsillar vein, also known as external palatine vein. How are you going to manage this patient was a question of NEET PG, yes, this year. So how are you going to manage this patient? Yes, we know that hemorrhage is the most common complication following tonsillectomy, and the protocol for management is that for reactionary hemorrhage, you will have to take the patient again back to the OT. And if it is a primary hemorrhage, patient is already anesthetized, patient is already in OT. So the first step will be removal of clots. Why do you need to remove the clots? Otherwise, you always study that if there is a clot, leave it, because clot means that fibrosis has occurred, hemostasis has occurred. But this is one place where you have to remove the clots. Another place, any other place you know of where you have to remove the clot for retraction to occur and bleeding to stop? Yes, yes, that is the uterus, the PPH. Yes. So here also you have to remove the clots. Why you have to remove the clots? For contraction of the muscle to occur, for retraction of the blood vessel to occur, and for bleeding to stop. So the superior constrictor, for its clipping action, we do not need anything in between. For proper clipping action, we need the clots to be removed. So the first step is remove the clot, and then with a vasoconstrictor pack, which means that gauze or a cotton ball soaked in vasoconstrictor, you put pressure on that area where you're seeing is oozing. So you just put a pressure, wait for some time. If it stops, well and good. If it doesn't, then you have to go for cauterize, or you can ligate. Yes. So which is the vessel that you are cauterizing? Yes, that is the vein, the external palatine vein. That's the most common cause of hemorrhage, and that was the question here. So again, in tonsillectomy is in the Central Institute exam has been asked what are the various hot methods and the cold methods of tonsillectomy. So cold methods, why they are known as cold? Because they do not produce heat, like you are operating with the knife, or you are dissecting and cutting with the snare, so dissection and the snare method, or you are removing it with micro debrider, which is like a rotating shaving blade. Yes, it eats up all the tissues very quickly, or with the scalpel, which vibrates. It is ultrasonically vibrating with very high rate of vibration. That is also again that is known as harmonic scalpel. All these are the cold methods. In the hot methods, we have the cautery, the laser, and the coblation. Yes, the laser that is used here is the carbon dioxide laser, and the coblation. Yes, coblation is coagulation with ablation, or sometimes it is also known as cold ablation. Yes, so don't get confused. Cold ablation or coblation does not mean that it is a cold method. It is known as cold ablation sometimes. Why? Because the heat that is produced following coblation is much less as compared to cautery or as compared to laser. But yes, it is a hot method. And in your exam was this picture given, and you were asked to diagnose what is this method of tonsillectomy. Yes, this is the coblator one, and this is what is coblation being done. So the coagulation as well as removing, ablation, cutting as well as coagulation is being done at the same time. So it reduces the operative time, it reduces the bleeding, and it accelerates the healing process. So the next question here is, below is the picture of an 8-year-old child who came to the OPD with the complaints of mouth breathing and crowding of the teeth. Yes, we can see crowding of anterior teeth here. And this appearance of the face is known as, yes, so mouth breathing, crowding of teeth anteriorly. And yes, also what we can see here is that the nasolabial crease also we cannot see much. Yes, anyway, let us see what the diagnosis is. What are the choices? Horse faces. Is it something like horse faces? No. Frog faces. Frog faces is seen in which condition? Yes, in angiofibroma. What is that frog faces? Yes, that is proptosis, swelling of cheek, broadening of nose. That is frog faces. Adenoid faces. Yes, this is the typical appearance of adenoid faces. What is golden hair? Golden hair syndrome. What is golden hair? This is not frog faces. This is not golden hair. Why? Because in golden hair, what happens is there is a lot of facial deformity. Only this restricted only to the mouth, just mouth breathing and crowding of anterior teeth. No. In golden hair, there are a lot of congenital abnormalities, and of the face, there's a lot of deformity. There is mandibular hypoplasia. Just see this picture. Yes. Can you see this? There is mandibular hypoplasia, and that will lead to a lot of asymmetry of the face. There is ocular deformity, and can you see the ear? Yes, so there are skin tags, there can be preauricular sinus, there can be a nausea, there can be microtia. So that is what is golden hair. It will not only be restricted only to the mouth. There can be seen in golden hair, cleft palate can be seen, but this child is definitely not golden hair. So we are left with adenoid facies. So if I ask you that in this patient of golden hair who is having a nausea, yes, or maybe microtia, how are you going to give rehabilitation to this child? Yes, how can you give rehabilitation to this child? Yes, it's an 8-year-old child with, you can see this. Yes, either you can go for reconstruction of the pinna. Yes, or if it was an earlier child or cannot afford reconstruction of pinna, does not want any, what is the hearing rehabilitation that you can give this child? Yes, you can go for BAHA. BAHA, bone anchored hearing aid. So yes, BAHA is a very favorite question of your Central Institute exams. And so where all can we use BAHA? Yes, whenever we cannot use a normal air conduction hearing aid, as in the deformities of the pinna or of the external auditory canal, congenital deformities, atresia, nausea, microtia, or when we cannot use a air conduction hearing aid because the ear is chronically discharging and the air conduction hearing aid will not work in that condition. Or also an important indication is when there is a unilateral deafness. For example, if there is a unilateral severe sensoneural hearing loss where one ear has become completely deaf. So now what you can do is the sounds from this ear can be transmitted to the other ear through Baha. How? Yes, this Baha is anchored to the bone. So when it picks up the sound, it vibrates the whole of the skull. So it stimulates not only this cochlea, also the other cochlea. So unilateral single-sided deafness, that is another indication of Baha. So let us also see what are the other questions that have been asked in the adenoid. So whenever a child has come to you with mouth breathing, with decreased hearing, yes, with this faces, high arched palate, anti-crowding of teeth, what we have to think of is adenoid hypertrophy. And yes, the X-ray might be given to you, and what you're seeing here, if just the X-ray is given, yes, so this is what you're seeing is the adenoid. What you're seeing is nasal passage. The airway is very, very narrowed. So this is the adenoid hypertrophy child. In fact, whenever a lateral view is given to you, you have to see the adenoid, you have to see the epiglottis. Epiglottis in epiglottitis is also seen in the lateral view, and also the pre-vertebral or the retropharyngeal abscess. That is, for that also a lateral view is given. So when this presentation is given in the lateral view along with the lateral view of the nasopharynx, it has to be adenoid that you have to focus on. And the diagnosis, yes, in this patient will be adenoid hypertrophy. The atypical appearance was the question that was asked in this exam, and that was the adenoid facies. The tympanometry, why decreased hearing? What condition of the ear is the patient having? Yes, serositis media. So the tympanometry will show which curve is the B type of curve. And the management of this patient will be, yes, so if he fulfills all the indication of adenoidectomy, what are the indications of adenoidectomy? If there is recurrent sinusitis, or recurrent ear infections, or chronic serositis media, or if the child has sleep apnea or dental malocclusion. So all these are the indications. If the child fits into all this indication, then you have to go for adenoidectomy. Yes, the position for adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy is same. It is the Rose's position. You know what the Rose's position is? Yes, Rose's position is extension at the cervical as well as extension at the atlanto-occipital joint. And in this position, this area of the face is lower down from the larynx. So the chances of the bleeding, if occurs, or the blood the blood loss, the bleeding that is occurring during surgery to get aspirated or go into the larynx and to the lungs is less if the larynx is at a higher level than as compared to this area where we are operating, the nasopharynx and the tonsil area. So what is the important contraindication of surgery is a repeated question. Yes, adenoidectomy, what is the important contraindication? Can you quickly tell me? Yes, it is velopharyngeal insufficiency. Velopharyngeal insufficiency, which velopharyngeal insufficiency? Cleft palate. So what happens if in a patient of cleft palate you do adenoidectomy, what will happen? Yes, so in this child, when there is a cleft in the palate, yes, if there is a hypertrophy of the adenoid, so this hypertrophied adenoid will completely fill the nasopharynx, and because of the cleft palate, all the features like nasal regurgitation of food, the nasal twang, that is hypernasality, all that will not be present. Yes, but if in this patient remove the adenoid following surgery, what will happen? There will be nasal regurgitation of food, not at all acceptable. The voice will change to a hypernasal voice. So before adenoidectomy, you always have to rule out velopharyngeal insufficiency. Which velopharyngeal insufficiency? Cleft palate, which is also seen in children. By chance a patient has cleft palate and also along with that adenoid hypertrophy, then you go for first operate the cleft palate and then go for adenoidectomy. So these are the things that you need to know in adenoidectomy. And yes, when you're doing adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy, for the methods are the same, the cold and the hot methods. For adenoidectomy also, as we did in tonsillectomy, the position is also the same, and both of the surgeries are usually done at the same time. Means we go for adenotonsillectomy, and there you need to know that when we are going for adenotonsillectomy, what is done first is adenoidectomy. We do adenoidectomy first because that area behind the nose, the nasopharyngeal area where the adenoid is present, where we are operating, that is a blind area. So till the time we put a pack, there is and then we do tonsillectomy, so there is enough time given for hemostasis to occur, and if following that, if there is any bleeding, by the time we have operated on the tonsil, we can come to know that yes, during this time the hemostasis should have occurred. If it is not occurred, then we need to inspect that area, or we need to pack that area, or we need to do something about that area. So that is what you need to know in this topic of adenoid. So those were the recall questions of INI-CET this year, and I hope you are preparing very hard. All the best, and if you believe in it, you can definitely do it.